Welcome to everybody, and many thanks for attending this, which is hosted by the University of Bath's Institute for Policy Research. My name is Fran Bennett, and I'm Emeritus Fellow at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at the University of Oxford. And I'm delighted to introduce to you Rebecca Florisson, who's the Principal Analyst at the Work Foundation at Lancaster University, who leads their research on insecure work, which is the topic we're going to be discussing today. She's also a part-time PhD candidate at Queen Mary University of London, and she previously worked in the employment unit at Eurofound, which people probably have heard about, which looks at working conditions in the European Union. She has an MSc in politics and public policy from Trinity College, Dublin. What we're going to do is discuss the realities of low pay, unpredictable hours, and poor protections at work, and the steps that may be possible to transform those, including the Employment Rights Act, which of course is very new. Rebecca and I will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open up for your questions, which if you could put them in the Q&A function rather than in the chat, that would be really helpful. So thank you very much for coming, and we all look forward to hearing from Rebecca. So first of all, Rebecca, the kind of very basic question. What do we mean when we talk about insecure work?
Yeah, so I think oftentimes when I talk to people, I think people think of insecurity as just one form of work. And the thing that I hear most often is people think about 0-hour contracts. And that's right, 0-hour contracts is quite a quintessential form of insecurity. But at the same time, I think insecurity is better studied as kind of a multi-dimensional phenomenon. So the way that we look at it at the Work Foundation is we look at this through the lens of contractual insecurity, financial insecurity, and a lack of access to basic rights and protections. Because actually we find that for lots of people, multiple forms of insecurity come together. And that is what we term to be severely insecure work. That's kind of where you see this cumulative effect being compounded for people. And currently about 6.8 million people in the UK are in severely insecure work. So that's about 1 in 5 workers. So that covers quite a substantial group of people.
Thank you very much. Does that have to be, just as a supplementary to that, does that have to be experiencing all the factors, or is it like 2 or more? Do you have a kind of cutoff threshold to call it in severely insecure work?
There is definitely a cutoff. So it depends on the data source that you look at. But when we use the labour force survey, we have about 9 indicators of insecurity. And if you have more than 2 factors coming together, we consider that to be severely insecure.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much, Rebecca. There's a slight delay on the sound, so I hope I'm not interrupting you. So I've been recently, when I've been reading about this in preparation for today, some people seem to call this insecure work, and some people call it precarious work. Is there any difference between the two? And if so, why would you use one rather than the other?
I think precarity and insecurity tend to be used now interchangeably almost. And I think understood that way as well, as you can use one or the other, sort of, especially in the public eye. We opted to use insecurity. And that's because we looked particularly at the literature around objective versus sort of subjective insecurity. Right. Subjective insecurity in the literature particularly is something that is often used when people look at health outcomes, so in the public health literature. So this is looking at people's feelings about their job. How likely do they think it is that they're going to lose their job within a given amount of time? What we used is objective measures of insecurity. So it doesn't really matter how people feel about it, but there are certain factors in their job that make it more insecure than another job. And in a way that is quite a helpful measure, because even though you might feel that your job is quite secure or etc., when you see that in times when there is an economic downturn or the landscape shifts, it is very much those people who are first at risk of losing their jobs.
Thank you very much. And I should say you do the Insecure Work Index at the Work Foundation. Yes, that's the database that you're kind of talking about when you're talking to us. Yeah.
Absolutely. So this is the framework. So the theoretical framework has these 3 dimensions of insecurity: the contractual, financial, and rights. And within that framework, we have 9 indicators of insecurity, and we bring those together into an index where we categorize people then as being in either secure work, moderately insecure work, or severely insecure work.
Great, thank you. And just quickly, the latest issue of that, the latest edition of the Insecure Work Index is for what year? Covering what year?
So this was in 2024, covering data in 2023, particularly because we found that the quality of some of the ONS data had declined a little bit because they were struggling to get the right sample sizes. But there will be a new iteration of that again in the future with updated figures.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Sorry, Rebecca, I keep interrupting you. And who are the workers, though? Who are we talking about? Who are the workers who are most affected by insecurity, and particularly severe insecurity?
So this tends to be the people that are usually already subject to other forms of labour market disadvantage. So we're seeing that women more likely to be in insecure work than men. I think it's 26% of women are in severely insecure work compared with 14% of men. Then it's young people, disabled workers, and people from specific ethnic minority backgrounds. We also see that insecurity tends to be concentrated in specific sectors and specific jobs. So we see higher concentrations in sectors like hospitality and services, and in jobs that are more sort of manually oriented.
Great, thanks very much. And I suppose the $64,000 question is why? Why are people in this kind of situation? What are the kind of causes that you've managed to explore, which explain why people are in insecure work?
It's basically a mix of both structural and some personal factors. In terms of sort of what structures this picture is that people live in specific places, people need jobs, and some economies are lagging a little bit. There might be more unemployment, there might be more inactivity, and you see that sort of lower productivity firms, lower productivity sectors tend to be concentrated there. And they're often less able to offer secure, sort of high-paid, high-quality jobs. If that's in your area, then that's kind of what you have to deal with. The personal factor then comes in. Not everybody is able to commute outside of that immediate zone.
Right.
And so that's where that picture comes in, where we see that it's women with caring responsibilities or childcare responsibilities, disabled people who struggle to commute farther away from home. They then tend to opt into those insecure jobs because they are closer to home. And another important point there is flexibility can be really hard to get in more secure jobs, but a lot of people need flexibility to enter into work and to remain in work. So again, it's people with caring responsibilities, it's disabled people. And then it's often not that they prefer insecure jobs, but it's the only kind of job that's available that is going to give them the flexibility that they need to even be in work.
Right, that's really helpful. Thank you. And what about the trends? I mean, are we talking about something which is increasing, which is decreasing, which is just kind of steady as she goes? What are the recent trends in this kind of work that you've seen in, because presumably you've done the index for several years now?
Absolutely. And we've even rolled it back to all the way to 2000. So we've got quite a long-term picture in terms of what insecurity looks like. And I think there's some commentators that have used phrases like insecurity has exploded, but that is not borne out by the data, at least not in the way that we measure insecurity. So when I look at the past 25 years, you see that roughly between 19% of workers and about 25% of workers are subject to severely insecure work in any given year. So there is a bit of variation there, but at the same time, that's not huge. Those are not huge differences. We do see that during the global financial crisis, insecurity went up a lot. And then particular groups would have struggled more with that. So that really fell on young workers, etc. But all in all, it looks like quite a stable picture. And then I think COVID was quite interesting because you would have expected maybe insecurity to go up quite a bit during that period, but those were the people that lost their jobs. So they actually disappeared from that picture temporarily, which raised the numbers of people in secure jobs, or like the proportion of people in more secure work. But that was obviously not a happy picture. Those people had lost their jobs, and then they did come back into the labor market afterwards, after the lockdowns, and the picture kind of stabilized again with quite those higher levels of insecurity.
Thank you. And just as a follow-up to that, I mean, you might say that those workers, as you say, range between 19% and 25%. I think the most recent is, as you said, about 1 in 5, 21% or so. But that still could have involved different weights of different indicators of insecure work. So I suppose the one that is the popular sort of imagination is 0 hours contracts. You know, those have exploded, people would say. Is that actually the case? So are there some factors which have changed, some indicators which have changed their weighting within? I mean, I hope this is not too detailed a question, but have they changed their weighting within the overall picture?
Yeah, that's such an interesting and I think insightful question. You do see that change over time. So low pay is something that you actually see going down. We've had all of these increases in the national minimum wage and the living wage. So you see low pay basically being eked out, which is generally a very, very good thing, even though people are still struggling with the cost of living. So are we better off? We're not sure that we are. I think 0 hour contracts is a really interesting thing because they only started measuring those in the labor force survey in 2013. That's kind of when it became kind of known in the public consciousness. So when we roll back the index to 2000, we're not even including 0 hour contracts. And we almost don't have to, because 0 hour contract workers have usually very specific forms of insecurity already coming together for them that class them as severely insecure. So they tend to be on low pay, unpredictable pay, temporary jobs, etc. So they have such a confluence of things coming together that over 75% of them are already classed as severely insecure work. You don't need the additional specific contract to kind of tell you that.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. What about international comparisons? Obviously we're talking about the UK today, but are international comparisons possible, or do they not have the data that you've got when you do the analysis in the UK? Is it not possible to do international comparisons, really?
It would certainly be possible, though a little bit tricky. I think when the UK was still part of the European Union, there was more interest in doing some of those comparisons. And I think colleagues at King's College London have done some reports on that in the past. Basically, in that time, there was an investment in harmonizing UK data sets with data sets across the EU, and that would have been very, very well possible. But that effort has stopped, so that data is no longer timely, which makes this a really difficult effort. I think on top of that, the labor market reality can look so different. So if you compare Germany to the UK, what could be considered insecure or a good measure of insecurity in the German labor market is going to differ substantially from what it looks like in the UK labor market. So you would probably end up with quite a narrow number of properly comparable indicators, but it certainly would be an interesting piece of work to pick up.
Yes. I mean, I know that, EU survey of income and living conditions, I think we're not part of anymore in the UK. So that would be one of those which, certainly, for my interest in poverty, for example, would be essential for the kinds of comparisons. And I suspect the same is true of labour market statistics, which used to be across European Union when we were in the European Union.
Such a shame when we look at that data. It's such a wealth, and like all of that data continuity just lost. It's such a shame.
Exactly. So I suppose what I wanted to do was come on to some of the possible answers to this, presuming that we are in agreement that severely insecure work is not a good thing. And therefore, what can we actually do about it in policy terms? And in turn, I think we may as well, to begin with at least, look at the Employment Rights Act, because my understanding is that the Employment Rights Act, which is now an act, I think, rather than a bill, is intended precisely to deal with some of the issues that you talked about at the beginning, which were about contractual problems, financial issues, and issues of basic rights and protections at work. Yeah. So what about it? What's the potential of the Employment Rights Act to deal with some of the problems that we've been talking about?
So it's definitely a very significant piece of legislation. I think it's the first piece of legislation in a good decade or even 15 years that tackles some of the things that we're seeing in the labour market. So generally a very welcome move. There's a lot of detail still to be worked out in secondary legislation. So now that it's an act, there are lots of government consultations coming out that will look to sort of deepen out exactly how all of these different measures are going to work. I recently did a piece of work where I estimated the impact of specifically the new rules around unfair dismissal and zero-hour contracts, how they were going to impact levels of insecure work, and found that it is quite substantial. So those two rules together would, if they had been in place in 2023, they would have reduced severely insecure work by 1.2 million people. So generally a very good thing. From 6.8 million people, 1.2 million people were taken off, and about 3.8 million people would have become properly secure. They would have had secure jobs. So that's quite a good result. At the same time, you'd still see that over 17% of people would still be in severely insecure work. So there's more to be done, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And I think partly this is because government is, I think, in a very practical way, tackling these quite pernicious forms of insecurity, and that's a really good thing. But at the same time, they're not looking at insecurity as this holistic thing, as these multiple issues that are coming together, which we do see in that data. As I mentioned in that example of zero-hour contract workers, you can adjust the contractual issue that might give a lot of them more predictable hours, but at the same time, they might still have low pay and they might still be on those temporary contracts. So in that sense, there's a lot more that needs to be done.
And that was the primary legislation, the Employment Rights Act, but presumably it has to go through regulations. Is there a lot still to play for in terms of that, or is it basically now set in stone in terms of what impact it's likely to have?
I think there's a lot to be decided still, and that's really going to make the difference between whether it's impactful and how impactful it's going to be exactly. So there will be a consultation, for example, on those guaranteed hours for zero-hour contract workers. But there's very particular issues around that they haven't worked out yet. So, for example, if we want to give a zero-hour contract worker guaranteed hours, what do we base those guaranteed hours on? That's probably going to be a reference period. But how long should the reference period be? And then furthermore, what if that period is what if the number of guaranteed hours is set at a certain number? What's going to happen when someone is asked to work more or less than that? Who's going to pay for that? Is there going to be overtime pay? Things like that. And also, how is this going to be enforced? Who's going to be responsible for enforcing these new rules? So in that sense, yes, I think that is where they always say that the proof is in the pudding. And I think that's really, really the case. I think it's going to be a potentially very impactful piece of legislation, but a lot of it is going to be about how it works out in practice.
And I think I'm right in saying that there's already been a change to the when the bill becoming an act, in terms of the how, well, you tell me. It was something to do with going from day 1 to 6 months. Was that protection from unfair dismissal? Is that right? So that's already changed. And
yes,
what impact does that have?
Yeah. In the final stages of the Employment Rights Bill becoming an act, being sort of ratified, it was ping-ponging back between the Commons and the Lords. And the sticking point was unfair dismissal. So people tend to be protected from unfair dismissal on grounds of protected characteristics anyway. But there is a specific form of unfair dismissal that currently you would be able to claim only when you've worked for your employer for more than 2 years. And government proposed to make that a day one right. The problem was that that was kind of leading to a lot of confusion about how that was going to interact with probation. A lot of people who start a new job would have probation of at least 3 to 6 months. So in the end, they decided to make this a right that you get once you've worked somewhere for 6 or more months, which in my mind is quite sensible. And it is something that we also foresaw at the Work Foundation when we started working on trying to estimate just what kind of impact this bill would have. So those numbers of 1.2 million people who would be coming out of severely insecure work, that should hold. So once this comes into effect, a good proportion of severely insecure workers should move out of severely insecurity.
Great. Thank you very much, Rebecca. And that, as I understand it, that was partly perhaps as a result of pressure from, employers have been saying, we've had the increase in the minimum wage, we've had the increase in national insurance contributions. Now we've got the Employment Rights Act coming down the track. This is just too much. Please, can you do something about it? My understanding is that change has actually reduced the cost of the Employment Rights Act to employers quite substantially. So from, I think, £5 billion to £1 billion. But is there still a risk of what you might call displacement, I suppose? In other words, all these protections are for employees, or are they for employees and workers? I know there are two different categories, but they're not for self-employed people, for example, or freelance workers. So is there a risk that employers will move people out from one kind of category to another as a result of the Employment Rights Act? Has that been looked at all?
I think it's certainly something that is of interest and that different people will be looking at. Sometimes this kind of thing can be hard to predict. So I think the point of the consultations and almost that secondary legislation is to try to close some of those loopholes. But certainly, I think, so generally, I meet with lots of very engaged, very progressive employers who just want to do right by their workers, who are often already doing things way above the minimum standard. But you also have some employers who really want to use flexible and cheap labor. And I think that's where you see some of those risks coming in. So, for example, around guaranteed hours, if it's more difficult to have people on 0-hour contracts or use that labor really flexibly, then yes, you might see some displacement where maybe people are being asked to work as freelancers, or we've even seen over the past year this kind of rise in really big retailers advertising quite low hour contracts on gig platforms. So I think that is something that needs to be considered very carefully, and that particularly, I guess, enforcement agencies kind of keep an eye on.
Thank you very much. And I suppose that leads me on Rebecca, to talking about self-employed people? Because again, as I understand it, the Employment Rights Act is about people who are employed, but I'm assuming that quite a lot of your workers who come into the UK Insecure Work Index are actually self-employed people as well as workers and employees. So, I mean, if they're not in the Employment Rights Act, what's the way forward for improving their kind of security in their working lives?
Yeah, I think a lot of self-employed workers were hit really hard during COVID. And I think that really showed government something just about how vulnerable that group is. So prior to COVID, we had over 5 million people working as self-employed, and that fell by a huge number. And it's still, that number hasn't recovered. But sort of, I think for government, there's quite a clear ask towards employers. So it makes sense that the employees fall kind of within that remit. With self-employed workers working for themselves, that's obviously a little bit harder. So they have committed to doing not a publication, a consultation to look again at employment status. Because in the UK, we have 3 legal statuses, and that is you can either be an employee, where you have all the rights and benefits. Then you have worker status, which sort of sits between self-employment and being an employee. So fewer rights and protections, but still some. And then you have being self-employed, and then you're not entitled to almost anything. So no maternity or paternity pay, no holiday pay, no sick leave, etc. So that is with 3 statuses, but then we have 2 tax statuses. And that's also where a lot of confusion comes in, and a lot of the, I guess, incentives sometimes for misclassification of workers as well. So government is going to be looking at this again. They did do this previously under the Conservative government. I think they responded to that consultation in 2018, but then decided not to act on it at the time. And that is also because it's quite a contentious issue. It's very complicated. And if you look internationally as well, lots of countries tackle this in very different ways. Some countries have a lot of employment statuses with very specific kind of brackets, and some have very few employment statuses. So there's a number of ways in which you can go about this, but I do think it's clear that something has to be done. But I don't have any good answers as to what should be done exactly.
You don't have any magic solutions? Wow. So going back to the kind of wider issue of insecure work, whether we're talking about self-employment or particularly employment and workers, what remains to be done? What else would we want to see government doing about this?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, I think it would be quite useful if government would adopt a more holistic definition of insecurity. So everything that fits kind of under that umbrella and that contributes to insecurity. I think as well, enforcement is really, really key. So government is going to be setting up the Fair Work Agency. So that should be launched in April this year. But it's still not clear what the remit of that body is going to be, or how it's going to overlap with already existing bodies like ACAS, like the Gangmasters Authority, etc. So there's quite a bit to be done there, because I think there's almost no point in offering people new rights if their existing rights are already not being appropriately enforced. And the system currently relies a lot on people identifying when their own rights have been violated, finding the right body to report to, and then somehow trying to find redress. But it's particularly the people in insecure jobs that really fear retaliation. So if you're in a zero hours contract, it's much harder to go against your boss or your manager, because you might not get more hours. You might lose that job. They can just give you 0 hours until you leave, basically.
Yeah.
So that is that is a problem. And it is good that this is being looked into and that there's going to be a new body trying to improve all of that. But at the same time, we don't need sort of more of the same per se. We need new, very proactive ways of tackling these issues that we're seeing in the labour market. And then another point, I think, is what you already mentioned as well, is that government has, with the Employment Rights Act, with minimum wage rises and with the increase in national insurance contribution, they've put quite a lot of pressure on employers. And I think that means that in the short to medium term, that limits what else they can ask employers to do. So I think we just need to be realistic about that. Like, I don't think there's going to be a second Employment Rights Act forthcoming anytime soon that is going to plug all of those other gaps that we're seeing. But that doesn't mean government doesn't have any other levers. I think it just means thinking a bit more creatively about how else we can improve working conditions in the UK. So, for example, are there things government could be doing, especially at a local level, in terms of incentivizing the creation of better quality jobs through procurement, things like that?
Yeah. That's really helpful. Thank you, Rebecca. And I suppose, sort of going slightly wider than this, because one of the things about insecure work, and one of the things which I suspect is most difficult about it, is the kind of financial insecurity. So that might be unpredictability, and it might be inadequacy, and it might be both together. If financial insecurity is part of all this, are there any other sources of income that we should maybe be looking at to stabilize people's income, to make sure they've got adequate income? I mean, like, you would immediately say the benefit system, for example. Now, one example would be, although it's not a traditional state benefit, as I understand it, the Employment Rights Act has amended statutory sick pay rights, for example, so that low-paid workers in particular may be more likely to get it, and people who've got short periods of sickness may be more likely to get it. Are there any other things around the benefits system? I know your expertise is employment, but are there any other ways we should be looking at this kind of laterally, not just in terms of employment rights, to do something about these problems?
Absolutely. So I think definitely that point that you made, financial insecurity is about kind of the height of pay, but it's also about the unpredictability of pay. And I think the welfare system plays a really important role in that. So severely insecure workers make up about 1/5 of the workforce, but they make up 55% of all of the workers on universal credit. So they're massively overrepresented there because of the conditions of their work, oftentimes low hours, low pay, etc. So yes, I think it's really useful to look at the statutory instruments like a statutory sick pay. It's a really good thing that eligibility was widened, and I think the number of days that you have to wait until you get paid as well have lowered, and that's a really, really good thing. Overall, the rate of statutory pay is really, really low, and people can't survive on that. They can't pay their rent on that. So I think that's a problem, because usually people that are better paid are in the kinds of jobs where they would get occupational sick pay, and they can kind of then buffer out a period of sickness. But it's particularly people in insecurity on low pay who are most likely to then only get statutory sick pay, and basically just struggle financially because they don't have a buffer. They haven't been able to save. And I think it forces some of those people to then work when they're actually unwell and exacerbate all of their health issues. And that's a problem, because there is a problem with health in this country and people becoming inactive due to sickness. Yeah. And all of those things. So recovery and having time for that is incredibly important. Then the other point there is universal credit as well is really important. As I said, insecure workers are sort of overrepresented in terms of the workers who make use of universal credit. But then they also have very particular issues with how the system works. Universal credit is usually calculated based on what you earned in this previous period. But if your income and your hours tend to fluctuate, then your universal credit payment is also going to fluctuate. And so some months, some people are going to get quite a bit of money and then almost no money at all the next month. And that makes it so difficult for people to plan their lives and to budget, etc. So when we've had conversations with people who were in insecure work and on universal credit, they said that sometimes they didn't want to take up additional hours. They didn't want to take up that because they were so worried about how it was going to affect their payments, that they would rather just struggle along but have the certainty of knowing exactly how much that payment was going to be, rather than be massively out of pocket and basically in trouble.
Yeah, I can very much empathize with that, because I was involved in the research team, which was headed by Jane Miller, which was based at the University of Bath Institute of Policy Research, where we are today. And that research was precisely about that kind of issue in universal credit. So particularly the people who've worked most on this, as well as Jane, are Rita Griffiths and Marsha Wood. And if anybody wants to look up that research, it's about universal credit, and it's done under the aegis of the Institute of Policy Research at the University of Bath. So that's great to hear you talk about that, Rebecca, because it's exactly what people who I was working with were focusing on. But just one other thing, which I think I've read in a Work Foundation report, actually, which was to suggest that there shouldn't be conditionality for people out of work. There shouldn't be conditionality to oblige them to apply for work which was actually insecure. Is that right? Am I right in remembering that? And would you suggest that that is considered or not?
I think this is a really interesting one. So for a long time, the Department for Work and Pensions and job centres have kind of operated by this rule that it's any job first, then based on the assumption that once you have that first job, you're going to get a better job, and then you're going to have a career out of it. What we've actually seen in the research that we've done is that, yes, some people move out of those kind of roles and obtain something better, but a lot of people just bounce back out of work because that kind of work is often, if it's not a match to your skills, if it's insecure, if it's low paid, it is often unsustainable. And so people bounce back out of work and then, or they fail to progress. So they become long-term stuck in insecurity. So, I mean, there's all sorts of things around conditionality where it's also simply not paying off the way they thought it would.
Right.
It's sometimes not a great use of both time and money to impose that kind of conditionality on people. But particularly when we're thinking about, look, we want higher productivity in the country. We want people to earn more, to have more spending power. Then the whole system needs to be geared towards getting people matched up with the right jobs and ensuring that when they leave the benefit system from unemployment, that they are able to stay in work, so that it's not just a seasonal job where they bounce back out in 3 months' time. Because you oblige these people to take up those roles, bad for mental health, bad for all sorts of things. But then also they've left again, but again they have a 5-week wait period. So they need to reapply for benefits. They have another wait period. So people get into debt. People get into huge kind of trouble. So definitely conditionality is something that we look at with quite a critical lens.
That's really helpful. And I was glad that you quoted the ABC of the approach to work of successive governments, actually. So any job, better job, career, ABC. So I think what we're suggesting is that may not always progress in the way that you'd expect the alphabet to progress, and it may just be any job, any job, any job, any job. If we don't have a look at how those jobs might lead more to progression than they currently do for many people. So I think that's a really good point to make, Rebecca. I'm going to stop our conversation there because we've gone just over our 40 minutes. and start to do some of the questions which have been put in the Q&A and encourage other people to do that. We may not have time to get to all of them, and I'm going to select a particular one now and then see what you think about that one, and then we'll see how many we can get to during the rest of the conversation. So just let me, I'm going to read this one out because it's quite complicated. So this is from Claire Bradley, and she says, if the part-time workers and fixed time prevention of less favourable treatment regulations were, you can see why I wanted to read it out, were properly enforced, then wouldn't that help reduce precarious work? In theory, those protections already exist, but companies tend to sack people who try and rely on them. Now, I don't know whether this is an area that you've looked at in particular, Rebecca, but that's Claire's question about existing legislation that should be better enforced than it is at the moment. I think that's what she means.
Yeah, I think that's where some of those gaps and loopholes kind of open up. And that's not unique to the UK. We recently looked at some Dutch case studies as well, because the Dutch were looking to ban 0-hour contracts, and they had some new rules around that. So we looked particularly at hospitality, and we found lots of big hospitality companies like hotels. They have an umbrella organization and then different franchises. So what they simply did when someone came to the end of their like temporary term, or their end of how you have a certain amount of time that you're allowed to work as a temporary worker or as a 0-hour contract worker. When that term ended, they would just move that person to a different franchise, but all under the same company umbrella. So absolutely, I think there's lots of gaps that open up. And if employers want to misuse that, there is scope for that. So yeah, I think this is where proactive enforcement is really key, because the workers did not seem to be aware of those rules and were not able to indicate to the correct authorities that those rights had been violated.
That's really interesting. So what we're saying is that awareness of the current legislation, but on the part of workers, and also enforcement of the current legislation on employers is important, as well as introducing new legislation to protect people. Am I understanding that right in terms of the more general point there?
Yeah. Absolutely. I think enforcement, unfortunately, still relies a lot on people being aware of those rights. So that means that if we bring in new rules through the Employment Rights Act, or there needs to be an awareness campaign among particularly the groups who are most likely to be affected by those rules, to tell them, hey, this is how these contracts work, this is what it means, and here are the avenues of redress that you can seek if you think something has gone wrong.
And presumably try and protect people from being sacked when they do that, which is the other thing that clearly may influence people's ability to take advantage of those rights of redress. Yeah,
very challenging. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Rebecca. I'm going to try another one another one in the Q&A, one of which is why is precarious work or insecure work so common within higher education? So there are lots of examples of and it's an area that you know about both as a consumer and as an employee, I think. So why is it that precarious work is so common in higher education? I'll just read it out. It's Claire Bradley again, actually. Higher education is a key area where 0-hours contracts and other forms of precarious work are really prevalent. Lecturers are often highly educated, but are often viewed as disposable and interchangeable. What are the factors that make 0-hours contracts and other forms of precarious work so common in higher education? I don't know whether you've got research on that or ideas about that.
Don't have research on that, but certainly have some ideas on it. And I imagine yourself as an academic as well, you will have seen how this works in multiple institutions. And I guess it's changed a lot over the years as well, hasn't it?
Yes, I mean, certainly I know we've lost valuable colleagues, largely because of, I have to say, because of short-term research grants, really. So they come in to do the research contract, and they have to leave partly because they have to support their families. They have to leave and get other jobs because they can't continue on temporary contracts. And that's researchers. And the question I know was talking about lecturers as well. So I don't want to divert it onto just one group, but certainly that's my experience, that people, sometimes lecturing as well, actually, but they were brought in on research contracts and were temporary and had to leave and get other things, sometimes academic and sometimes related.
Yeah, I mean, I've only been part of a university for, say, the past 7 years, and I guess as a policy centre, we occupy quite a sort of a special space in that, where we're a little bit, we're not lecturing or anything like that, but I think what I hear from academic colleagues is that it has changed a lot, and it's probably related to the funding model of these institutions, with class sizes hugely expanding, an increased focus on foreign students being brought in, and a cost cutting in lots of areas. So I mean, in the past, maybe you could have gotten a tenure track roles and things like that, and it seems like that's a lot harder currently. Those kind of permanent roles almost don't exist anymore. Right. And then a lot of the actual research, like the grant research being done, you get postdocs. I've met postdocs who are on their third or fourth postdoc, and all of that means that there's no security beyond the 3 to 5 years that you're on a grant, that there's also no pay progression, and all of those things. So I definitely see that as a big issue within the sector. And it seems now with universities struggling as they are, that this is also something that's coming to a bit of a head.
Thank you very much. You may not be able to do this off the top of your head, Rebecca, but it's just possible that you've got something around you which would tell you the answer. Somebody has asked about the 9 indicators of insecurity that you use when you look at you did mention, you said there were 9 that you use when you look at insecure work or severely insecure work. Have you got access to those where you can look at them now? Or if not, I'm not going to press you.
I can do most of them off the top of my head. Also happy to refer people to the Work Foundation website. So we did our first index in, I think it was 2022. And that has both a technical annex and a really good overview of all of the indicators, why we picked them, how we went about that, how you can build your own index, etc. So feel free to look at that. But yes, off the top of my head, under sort of contractual insecurity, we looked at temporary jobs, involuntary temporary jobs as kind of something separate, part-time work, involuntary part-time work, and then financial insecurity. We looked at unpredictable pay. We looked at low pay as something like below 2/3 of the median. And we included people with second jobs, because we found that some people do have like highly professional jobs. They do a bit of gigging here on the side, etc. But actually the majority makes a lot less in their main job than people who just hold down one job. So that speaks to some sort of economic need. And then we have access to rights and protections. Definitely solo self-employment was included in that. So people who really work for their own account as a freelancer, or not with anybody else, essentially. So I've lost track of how many indicators I'm at, but that will give you that will give you a sense of what's roughly included. But please look at that index. And so we've done one for that you can basically use on the labor force survey, which is really, really cool. And then have done one separately, the same theoretical framework with mostly the same indicators, but based on availability as well, for understanding society, which is also cool because that's a longitudinal data set. So if you create an index based on that, basically you can track people over time as well and see how they move. Do they move out of insecurity? You can answer all sorts of cool questions.
That is incredibly useful, Rebecca. And I think I ought to say at this point, I should have said it earlier, that if you have a look at the chat function, basically the links for all the things we're talking about are being put up there helpfully for us while we are on this webinar. So you will find, for example, the website for the Work Foundation there. And I think the explanation that Rebecca's just given of the 2022 report with the technical annex and the overview is just incredibly useful, so that people can go to that after this webinar and find out more about those indicators and why they were chosen, and also the longitudinal work that Rebecca was talking about is, I think, fascinating. I mean, I was very struck by some research into employment some years ago by the Gender and Employment in Local Labour Markets research, and they were finding, for example, that women who would take local part-time jobs, not necessarily insecure temporary contracts or anything, but they would just stay in those jobs even when their children had grown up and they didn't necessarily have the same urgent need for the flexibility that they did when their children were younger, but they just stayed there. So I think the progression from low paid or insecure work is a really interesting issue, and it was one that the Work Foundation has looked at because they've got this longitudinal analysis. So I think that's fascinating. There are a couple of other questions in the question and answer. So I'm just going to give you both of those, Rebecca, and see what you have got to respond to on both of them. And then I think we'll be almost done probably. So I'll just do that if you're able to absorb two at once. One is, can you say something about inequalities in pay? You mentioned that low pay is going down, meaning the numbers who are low paid are going down. But simultaneously, is executive pay not going up faster and the gap in pay between executive and average workers increasing? That goes, I think, a bit wider than this webinar, if you like, because it's not just about insecure work. It's about the gap between executive and average worker pay. So see what you think about that one. And then another one was, can you say anything about trends from before 2000? And on links, the potential links, I think they mean, between the reductions in unionisation and trends in insecure work. And that could be in the UK or beyond. So you've got two rather broader questions there than the agenda we were setting. But if you're interested in responding to either of those, please, or both of them, please do.
I can tackle both. I don't know how useful my contribution is going to be, but yes, about sort of that inequality in pay. So low pay is basically being eked out because government is trying to, well, has, I think quite successfully, tried to raise the national minimum wage and the national living wage to 2/3 of the median. So a lot of the measures that poverty researchers and that the index was using have become slightly obsolete because it looks like low pay has gone down to zero over, say, the last year and a half. At the same time, we know that people are still hugely struggling. Like the actual real increase in pay over time has stagnated since the global financial crisis. We're hardly better off than we were around that time. So that's certainly an issue. Around CEO pay, I really don't know too much about that, but I know there's measures like the Gini coefficient who keep track of that kind of inequality and divergence, and then you can use that for international comparisons as well. So that's my only contribution. That's probably the area you'd want to be looking at, though I'm not too knowledgeable about that myself. In terms of basically what happened before 2000, so this is where we really run into limitations in the data. Like the labour force survey has maybe kicked off properly, or like had more continuous measures from 1995 onwards. But a lot of the things change, a lot of the variables change over time. So you can't quite compare a specific type of contract right now with one of 30 years ago. I think people definitely have the sense that insecurity in that time has changed a lot. Of course, rates of unionization have dropped a lot. We do see some in a lot of insecure contracts, insecure jobs, unionization levels tend to be quite low. So there is certainly something of interest there to explore. I know one of my colleagues at the Work Foundation was kind of looking into this. What we are doing that is taking a more historical look is we are now embarking on a project funded by the Nuffield Foundation, looking at deindustrialized areas and how that deindustrialization has the potential maybe to impact even levels of insecure work in those local economies even today, and looking specifically at the experiences of people from ethnic minority backgrounds in those areas. So we'll be using census data for that, because census data does go back, of course, a lot further. But again, specific indicators relating to work tend to be very, very poor. So yes, I guess we have to make do with what we've got in that sense.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And on behalf of the Institute of Policy Research, I want to thank you for your great contribution. I enjoyed speaking to you when we were preparing this, and I very much enjoyed speaking to you today as well. And thank you to all the participants who joined us online, and especially for your really interesting questions, which it was great to hear the answers to from Rebecca. And I also want to thank Amy, who was helping us, who was setting this up for us. Thank you so much. And to watch or listen to previous events that the Institute for Policy Research has done, then of course go to its website. And thank you so much again, everybody, for coming. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fran.